American infantrymen pushed open the heavy metal gates and immediately stopped before a pile of mangled bodies in black uniforms. Over 50 SS guards lay dead in the camp dirt. Men with hollow cheeks and exposed ribs stood quietly right over the torn corpses. A calm Alpine spring breeze blew across the bloody mud. On the 6th of May 1945, the 80th Infantry Division of the United States Army walked into Ebensee. They expected a routine rescue mission, but the scene before them defied all standard military reports. Months of severe starvation and daily beatings finally broke the inmates' minds. Just hours before the first jeeps arrived, these starving prisoners cornered their former masters. The desperate men beat the guards to death using bare hands and heavy rocks. To find the root of this uprising, investigators pulled the sealed Alpine construction files. 1,000 men stood shivering on bare ice. The bloody revenge seen in May 1945 did not begin in the spring. It actually started with the deadly November frosts of Upper Austria. On November 18, 1943, SS commanders signed the paperwork. They opened Ebensee under the secret code name Zement. It belonged to the Mauthausen network, a camp sitting 90 kilometers away. The location offered solid limestone mountains. Officers wanted giant underground factories. They needed bomb-proof tunnels to assemble V-2 rocket parts away from Allied planes. The command ordered electric fences set up first. Guards built tall wooden watchtowers along the jagged perimeter. They secured the outer cage, but they completely ignored the housing. The very next day, November 19th, the first heavy transport arrived. Guards unloaded 1,000 prisoners directly into the freezing Alpine Valley. The temperature dropped below 0 degrees Celsius. The frozen Alpine earth crunched loudly under the bare feet of men wearing nothing but thin cotton uniforms. They had no coats. They lacked warm food. The Nazi officers calculated this exact outcome. Throwing starved people into a winter peak without roofs was a planned method of murder. Officers used the freezing mountain weather as a cheap weapon. Prisoners swung heavy pickaxes. They hauled rocks by hand. The command demanded deep caves to protect expensive German machines. Yet those same workers were dumped outside to freeze in the open air. This icy dirt would soon become the foundation for thousands of dead bodies. There were no barracks built for that first night. How do you survive without shoes? From November 1943 to June 1944, winter in the Alps. Infection started with frozen feet. They wore rotting wooden clogs. No replacements came. A prisoner steps barefoot on snow. The wood rots away. Skin hits frozen mud. Frostbite sets in quickly. From the ice, guards drove survivors inside. Wooden barracks became disease hubs. The barracks were built for 100 men. Guards locked 750 inside. Calculate the space. 750 men in a 100-man block. Less than half a square meter per person. Men fought for floor space. They lay packed tight. No room to turn. The doors stayed locked. Thick stench of waste filled the air. Excrement and decay. No one could breathe. Lice multiplied. Men just watched. Black tissue and gangrene crawled steadily across the splintered wooden bunks as men slowly died side by side. Once the infections ripped through those overcrowded barracks, the inmates faced a calculated starvation. Block 23 was officially designated on paper as a medical facility, but in reality, it was just a storage warehouse for the dying. The daily allowance for a forced laborer hovered around 700 kilocalories. This portion equaled less than a third of the biological requirement needed for heavy physical labor. Every morning began with half a liter of watery coffee. The afternoon offered hot water mixed with dirty potato peels, while the evening brought 150 grams of black bread. Because of this caloric deficit, starving bodies began to digest their own muscle tissue to keep the organs working. Healthy men deteriorated into skeletons who could no longer fight off a simple cold. When they finally collapsed, the guards dragged them straight into Block 23. Inside that filthy wooden hut, the boundary between the dead and the dying vanished completely. Men lay piled in heaps across the dirt floor without receiving any medical attention. For these prisoners, the crematorium slowly became the only guaranteed way out. Whenever a fresh batch arrived at the compound, the old prisoners would quietly whisper a dark truth to the newcomers. They told the fresh arrivals to look up at the smoking chimney of the crematorium. They pointed at the gray pillar and explained that flying through that vent was the only way to leave the camp. By April 1945, the death toll inside the warehouse reached a new peak. In just a single 24-hour period, the crews dragged out exactly 80 bodies. Why hollow out a massive labyrinth inside solid rock? The answer is just madness. They needed an underground factory to launch strikes against the United States. The starvation diet and those endless epidemics had a cold purpose. Nazis systematically squeezed every drop of energy from human bodies for Project Zement. V-2 rockets demanded subterranean space. Commanders needed deep bunkers to shield production from Allied B-17 bombers circling above. So tens of thousands of people became disposable digging tools. Deep underground, iron pickaxes struck blindly against cold stone in total darkness. Every single swung tool meant another breath choked by heavy dust. They continuously fed the crematorium ovens with exhausted prisoners just to keep clearing those massive mountain caverns. Workers gouged out the solid mountain for 18 grueling months. Guards thought they were breaking the will of mere animals. They were completely wrong. In May, the heavy trap finally snapped shut for exactly 53 overseers. 11 hours in the bitter frost, or 8 below ground. That was the fixed rate, the cost of 1 cubic meter. The Reich was bleeding time. By 1944, the front was collapsing. They pushed men past the limit. Tunnel A refined oil now. Tunnel B stamped steel bearings. Panzer divisions needed them desperately. Time ran out. Down there, oxygen vanished. Thick stone dust hung heavy. Dust choked them. Every breath scraped the throat. People were just fuel, expendable items for the war. SS guards pushed them harder. Civilian foremen watched the clocks. Legs gave out constantly. Hearts stopped in the dirt. Men just dropped. Bodies hit the floor. The dead were replaced fast. Guards dragged them away. No breaks allowed. These were the gray limestone walls. They drank the blood of fallen men daily. Each exhausted prisoner faced a strict law of survival until their starved bodies finally broke down under the weight of the mountain. 11. Why did the head capo of the 19th Block force men to exercise after a shift? He traded their remaining strength for a scrap of bread from the guards. The crematoria ovens burned at over 800 degrees Celsius, yet they could no longer handle the sheer volume of bodies falling in the tunnels. The senior capo stepped into the barracks. He blew a whistle. Exhausted prisoners dragged themselves outside into the dark. They ran in circles and dropped to the cold dirt over and over again. 10 continuous days without normal sleep under severe physical strain is the biological limit of human survival. Exactly 10 days later, every single man in the 19th Block collapsed and died. Ebensee held over 27,000 prisoners during its operation. The camp broke their bodies. It destroyed their minds. Starving men became ruthless henchmen. They beat their friends to secure another day of breathing. Anton Gans took command as the front lines collapsed in 1945. He brought a new method of mass erasure. Gans ordered inmates to dig giant trenches. Workers dumped the dead and the dying into these massive holes. A sharp chemical smell of quicklime burned the nostrils of the gravediggers. Inmates poured thick white powder over the victims. Under the heavy layer of white lime, living legs still twitched. Gans buried men who were still gasping for air just to clear space for the next wave. The camp turned victims into willing executioners. Survival meant stepping over the dead. They killed their own. What justified burning bodies on such an industrial scale? Project Zement held absolutely no real cement. Inside the dark mountain, Nazis prepared rockets. New York was their ultimate secret target. Thousands choked on white lime dust. They died for a futuristic tech dream. The Waterfall Project demanded endless rivers of fresh human blood. Guided supersonic missiles, clear enemy skies. But Berlin wanted far more blood. They actively developed the America Bomber. They designed a long-range flying beast for this mission. Strike America, burn New York. Pure madness. The exact flight distance from Berlin to New York spanned 11,600 kilometers across the ocean. How did the guards entertain themselves after a shift? They turned murder into a betting game. To force dying men to build rockets, continuous terror was the only working tool. Georg Bachmeier set the standard. He owned a large Alsatian named Lord. The dog was his primary weapon. A prisoner was dragged to a tree. Guards tied his hands behind his back. They hoisted him up. His feet hung a few inches off the dirt. Lord stood below. The dog growled, teeth bared, waiting for the command. Bachmeier gave it. The animal tore into the helpless hanging man. Bachmeier watched in silence. He waited until the victim stopped moving. Otto Riemer took command in early 1944. He drank heavily. He viewed the inmates as cheap targets. Riemer encouraged a specific sport. A guard snatched a prisoner's cap. He tossed it toward the restricted zone by the high-voltage wire. The inmate stood frozen. He had to fetch it. The guard waited, rifle raised. The prisoner took one trembling step forward. The rifle cracked. The guard reported a thwarted escape. These deaths were officially sanctioned. Riemer actively rewarded the shooters. He handed out extra cigarette rations for every confirmed kill. Murder became a lucrative evening hobby. The terror peaked on the night of May 18, 1944. Riemer drank himself into a rage. He gathered a small group of SS soldiers. 15 men died in just a few minutes. That sudden body count matches the rapid pace of a fully trained military firing squad. Riemer kicked open the barracks door and opened fire on the sleeping inmates. An Italian prisoner caught the stamp of a traitor from the guards and his own bunkmates the day Mussolini fell. In this frozen meat grinder, the chances of survival came down to a simple passport. September 1943 changed everything for these men. The SS treated them as defectors, and other inmates despised them. White Alpine snow became a quiet backdrop for a very specific tragedy. Of 955 Italians in the camp, 512 never left. The Italians dropped from exhaustion until their death toll hit 53%, while the Spaniards lost less than 1%. Veterans of the Civil War relied on strict internal discipline to keep their people alive. They shared rations and refused to break down. The Spanish prisoner mortality rate stayed at exactly 0.9%. How do you kill 2,000 people without a single bullet? You leave them standing in a March blizzard. Commandant Anton Ganz stepped right over the usual drunken shootings. He dragged the vicious Alpine weather into his execution plans. It happened on March 3, 1944. A heavy transport train pulled into the freezing camp from Wels. Guards threw open the doors. They dumped exactly 2,000 Jewish prisoners straight into a blinding snowstorm. Think about that massive crowd. 2,000 severely exhausted humans equals the total capacity of 4 standard passenger trains. Ganz flatly refused to let them rest. He locked them out. The screaming icy wind of the March blizzard ripped right through their frail bodies. That biting cold felt like shattered glass against their exposed skin. Ganz ordered the entire terrified crowd to stand motionless out in the open yard. 2,000 shivering people were left out there to freeze for 2 solid days and nights. They huddled closely together just to survive the freezing temperatures. It did not work. Men started dropping. Severe hypothermia paralyzed their trembling limbs. Total physical exhaustion choked the very life out of them. The thick white snow simply buried them exactly where they fell. Eventually, the raging storm passed. The sun came out. The heavy snow began to melt away from the harsh, rocky ground. It exposed a truly horrifying scene right in front of the dark tunnel entrance. Hundreds of stiff, frozen bodies lay stacked like cordwood on top of each other. This was mass extermination handed over to Mother Nature. The Reich did not waste a single drop of poison gas on this dying crowd. They weaponized the weather instead. This calculated neglect pushed the overall Jewish mortality rate at the camp to exactly 40%. How do you escape thousands of tons of hidden explosives? You just refuse to walk. The right collapsed. Commander Anton Gans panicked. He ordered everyone underground. Soldiers wired the tunnels. They packed heavy dynamite, enough to shatter solid granite vaults. The Berg Crystal network covered 10,000 square meters. It was a massive underground labyrinth. Gans wanted them inside. He screened orders. The starving prisoners resisted. They stayed in their barracks. Nobody moved. Thousands answered with dead silence. They completely ignored the shouting. The plan failed. The SS lost their nerve. They dropped their loaded weapons. Steel hit the dry dirt. The inmates heavily outnumbered them. Panic overtook the armed men. Time ran out. May 5, 1945. The SS butchers fled into the dark, abandoning the massive death camp to a handful of confused elderly German guards. The camp lost control. Darkness swallowed the escaping SS officers. The crowd turned on their former overseers. Fear evaporated. Raw, bloody rage took its place. For over a year, inmates endured daily beatings and starvation. But now, the prisoners hunted down their tormentors. They targeted the capos. These collaborators enforced the rules. The hunt moved through the barracks. The mob captured and executed 52 capos. Heavy blows landed on flesh and bone. Angry inmates dragged the battered bodies across the muddy ground, pulling them straight to the crematorium area. All discipline vanished. No rules existed, just survival and revenge. The killing stopped when American tanks from the 11th Armored Division broke through the gates. The Allied forces secured the perimeter. 52 capo corpses lay scattered right next to the ovens. Would an American prosecutor step in to stop a camp lynching? Ben Ferencz just stood there and watched. The inmates had caught a fleeing SS guard right by the blazing brick ovens. They grabbed the shouting guard by his torn uniform, pulling his body across the rough concrete floor. They bound his limbs to the heavy metal corpse tray, the exact equipment he used to burn their friends for 18 months. The heat from the open furnace washed over the gathering crowd, but they shoved the screaming man directly into the flames. The man who would soon serve as the chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg Einsatzgruppen trial chose to do nothing. Ferencz knew that 22 Nazi commanders would soon face formal justice under his watch, yet he let this execution happen. He understood that human rules carried zero weight in this specific place. The law stepped aside for revenge. American infantry walked into the camp to stop the endless dying. They wanted to bring immediate relief to these walking skeletons. Instead, they brought a brand new physiological nightmare. Freedom actually killed these people much faster than Nazi bullets. The first hearty United States military canned rations simply tore their weakened digestive tracts entirely apart. The soldiers eagerly handed out their rich, heavy food to the crowd. Starving men grabbed the thick tins with violently shaking hands. They swallowed the meat whole. They gulped down the solid calories with a desperate, animalistic speed. But their completely shriveled organs could not process the sudden intake. They just shut down. A severe medical condition known as refeeding syndrome triggered a fatal electrolyte crash. Years of severe starvation had entirely ruined their physical structures. The sudden rush of dense calories became a highly lethal poison. Massive stomach ruptures followed. Piercing screams soon echoed across the hastily assembled medical tents. Sharp, tearing pains hit the fragile survivors almost instantly after eating. Men collapsed on the dirt right after taking their first real bite of solid food in years. Good intentions quickly turned into pure physical horror for everyone involved. The rich army food literally ripped these broken people open from the inside. This rescue effort rapidly morphed into a chaotic mass casualty event. Helpless American medics watched the devastating biological reaction unfold before their eyes. Over 730 people died in sheer agony right after their liberation. It was a cruel paradox. The exact thing meant to save them ended up destroying their bodies completely. Over 1,000 individuals remained hospitalized in critical condition for months. Why did 8,000 people die in the Alpine dirt? For illusory rockets. The weapons never even launched. It failed. Those who survived the capos left a grim tally. They survived the SS guards. They survived the lethal rescue rations. The final math was staggering. 8,200 dead. That is the final count. 18 months of camp operation. 31% of the entire inmate population died. The scale was massive. That equals an entire modern European town. A whole community wiped off the map, erased completely. The Third Reich consumed them. They dug Zement tunnels into solid rock. Men broke. They dug until their hearts stopped. Nameless graves sit at the cold foot of the Alps, deep in the freezing Austrian mountains. Men became mere disposable material. They died for hollow military ambitions. The massive rocket project achieved nothing. Production quotas meant zero in the end. Time ran out. The bodies piled up anyway. Starving men hauled heavy limestone daily. No miracle weapons saved the crumbling regime, just frozen corpses dumped in the snow. The project demanded blood. The guards wanted results. Thousands vanished into the mountain shafts. They never saw the sun again. The dirt covers it all today. The explosives stayed rigged in the dark. The mine tunnels ultimately became a massive grave for thousands of people, exactly as Hans had planned.